This is an ABC podcast.
Hello and welcome to The World Today. I'm Sally Sara. This Monday, a society divided. Are the poor at risk of being left behind in the race to get people vaccinated? And the science of COVID modelling. How do experts try to predict the future?
We're making estimates of how virulent and how transmissible the virus is. This is sort of a observational exercise, and so the modelling can't take all of those things into account.
As some restrictions ease in New South Wales today, the Premier Gladys Berejiklian is warning residents not to get complacent. The state has recorded 1,257 new COVID cases today and 7 deaths. While concern is still aimed primarily at COVID hotspots of Western and southwestern Sydney, the inner city and the inner west are now on the radar too. Yesterday was supposed to be the last day the Premier would give the scheduled daily COVID press conference, but she's been back at it today. For more, Catherine Gregory joins me now. Kat, does New South Wales think that the numbers have stabilised?
Well, the past couple of days have been a little bit more promising, cases hovering around the 1,200 mark. Today, 1,257 new cases. Well, late last week, the infections were actually climbing higher than that. Now, the Premier did say last week we were expected to hit a peak around now or later this week, so it's hard to know if this peak is actually still coming. But she did say that infection rates are starting to stabilise in Western and southwestern Sydney. These are the areas of greatest concern in this outbreak. Here's Gladys Berejiklian.
Southwestern Sydney and Western Sydney remain our areas of concern in Greater Sydney area. However, we are seeing a stabilisation in some local government areas of concern, and that's positive. We hope that continues. However, we have seen also an increase in cases, as we mentioned yesterday and the day before, in the inner Sydney areas of Glebe and Redfern.
Now, today is also the first day of eased restrictions in the state. So, for example, that means that fully vaccinated people can picnic in groups of 5 outdoors. However, the Premier warns people to not get complacent with this, not let their guard down, because super spreader events can still happen. And there's also this very big concern that we're still waiting on a surge in hospitalisations to come, and with that means more deaths.
And Kat, what's happening with these 11 o'clock press conferences? Because last week the Premier said that yesterday was going to be her last regular COVID update, but she's been back in front of the media today. What happened?
Well, yes, she was asked this exact question, actually, and said that she was actually scheduled to appear today to discuss some of the milestones, like the vaccination targets. She copped a fair bit of flack last week when she said she'd stop doing these regular 11 a.m. press conferences, people saying she needed to front up for scrutiny, particularly as the worst of the outbreak is still expected to come. And today she said that there might be some weeks where she's up in front of the media answering questions every day, and some weeks where it's less than that. It'll just depend on what's actually going on. Now, today, for example, her message was clear: get vaccinated, because there is some concern that vaccination rates are actually starting to slow down.
And Kat, where does all this leave New South Wales in terms of being able to open up further next month?
So the Premier says we're still on track to ease restrictions from when 70% of the eligible population is double vaccinated. That is expected to be in late October. Now, remember, those eased restrictions are only for the fully vaccinated. At the moment, 78.5% of people over 16 have had 1 jab, and more than 46% have had 2 jabs. Now, the question is, what's going to happen for those people who aren't vaccinated? When will they get their freedoms? So Gladys Berejiklian addressed that very question.
I want to say very clearly, if you're not vaccinated, you will not have the freedom or the freedoms that vaccinated people have, even when we get to 80% double dose. And it won't only be government decision. A private business might choose only to welcome patrons who are vaccinated. An airline might say you can only fly with us if you're vaccinated.
The Premier also pointed out that there are pockets of New South Wales and Sydney where vaccination rates are still really low. Now, central Sydney is one of those areas, and that's also the area where we're seeing escalating rates of infection. So that's also partly because it houses lots of vulnerable people who may not have had access to the vaccine just yet.
We're about to hear more of that. Kat, thank you very much. That's our reporter, Catherine Gregory. Well, community groups are racing to get Sydney's public housing residents vaccinated before COVID outbreaks spread any further, and also before lockdown restrictions start to ease in a month's time. The New South Wales government is worried worried about a rise in cases in inner city suburbs, especially home to large public housing towers. There's concern that these residents and other low-income earners will bear the brunt of COVID as the virus inevitably spreads. Isabel Rowe reports.
The public housing units in Sydney's inner suburbs are home to some of those most vulnerable to COVID-19.
Social housing is mostly all pensioners, aged people and people with disabilities or single mothers, families.
Richard Weeks is a resident of one of the towers in Waterloo, just south of the CBD. He's also president of the Waterloo Public Housing Action Group.
You've got your mixed religions down here. We've got just about every religion there is. And a lot of them down here, they can speak English, but they can't read English.
In the last few weeks, COVID has spread from the city's west into the city, and several residents of public housing are in isolation in their apartments. Each time that happens, Richard Weeks says New South Wales Health issues a notice to other residents.
It's all done in English. About 1/3 of the community can't read English. This is where we come into it. Us tenants, we have to provide our own translator services.
Community services group Counterpoint has been asked by the New South Wales Government to help remove barriers to vaccination in the city's public housing units. For some, it's as simple as allowing internet access to book an appointment. Its chief executive is Michael Shreenan.
We've got clients that are unsure of their vaccine options. They're not getting information about pop-ups clinics, so they're phoning to know where's the best place to get their vaccine, how they can get their vaccine, get assistance with booking. Some of the tenants have transport issues, so we're trying to help them access transport options.
While some of that information has been slow to disseminate, he says one particular message has stuck. And that is the misconception that there is something to fear from the AstraZeneca vaccine.
There is a bit of hesitancy when it comes to the AZ vaccine. Obviously, there's a lot of confusion and fear around all the media that covered the rollout of the AZ. So a lot of people have been holding out for Pfizer options, which is now accessible, and there's lots of pop-up clinics, so it's more accessible than it was.
Do you have any idea of the rate of vaccination, the numbers?
No, we don't. So one of the things we're doing is an electronic survey and a postcard survey to try and get those numbers. We reckon probably about 1/3 to 2/3 are already vaccinated. I mean, in Redfern and Waterloo, I think it was sitting at 50% had their first dose.
The Australian Council of Social Services is calling on the New South Wales Government to make public its data on vaccination rates for low-income earners. It's those people who will bear the brunt of COVID-19 when the state opens up, according to Chief Executive Cassandra Goldie.
We know that people on low incomes live everywhere across the community, and we also know that people on lower incomes are more at risk to the ravages of COVID. So we should care about whether those vaccination rates amongst different parts of the community by income are being secured at the same rate.
She wants the New South Wales Government to agree to vaccination targets in low-income communities before restrictions ease.
We don't have a concrete plan about that at this time. That's not on the public record. Nobody wants to see anybody at high risk being left behind in this plan.
That's Dr. Cassandra Goldie. She's the CEO of the Australian Council of Social Service. And that report from Isabel Rowe. Well, let's take a look at Victoria today. And the situation is worrying. Victoria has recorded its highest daily COVID numbers since August last year, with 473 new locally acquired cases. Our reporter Bridget Fitzgerald joins us now from Melbourne. Bridget, what do we know about these new cases today?
Sally, of those 473, 202 have been linked to known outbreaks. The main concern today is about 4 childcare centres that have been listed as Tier 1 exposure sites overnight. They're across different parts of the city, so the northern and western suburbs where much of our outbreak is concentrated, but also there's one in the southeastern suburbs as well. There's also an emerging outbreak at the Fitzroy Community School, that's in Melbourne's inner north, where at least 31 staff and students have been infected so far. And there's also continued disruption to Victoria's regional public transport system, that's V-Line. So buses will replace trains on most of that network tomorrow, with more than 300 staff at V-Line isolating. Some good news, though, with vaccinations. At least 66.2% of the population have had a single dose of a COVID vaccine. That's aged 16 and over. 41% are fully vaccinated, and the state government has confirmed today that there'll be a blitz on vaccines within the building and construction industry. Construction workers have been identified as being young, highly mobile and unvaccinated, and they'll be given priority access to the Pfizer vaccine across 4 major state hubs.
Bridget, thank you. That's our reporter in Melbourne, Bridget Fitzgerald. Let's stay in Melbourne now. Melbourne's lengthy lockdowns have decimated the city's art scene. But bosses at one of the nation's best-known and oldest arts organisations, the Melbourne Theatre Company, have some good news with a $5 million lifeline from a federal government fund. Samantha Donovan prepared this report.
I want to take you to a museum in Amsterdam. I want to kiss your neck amongst the Rembrandts. The marble that looks like flesh. How did they do that?
Actress and writer Virginia Gay enchanted viewers of the ABC's Q&A program recently with a monologue from her adaptation of Cyrano de Bergerac. She'd written it in lockdown and saw it as a perfect way to celebrate coming back to the theatre. But after just 3 performances, Melbourne went back into lockdown and the season at the Melbourne Theatre Company was cancelled. Virginia Lovett is the company's co-CEO.
To be locked down on opening night for Lockdown 6 was extraordinarily brutal for the company.
And the MTC has just announced its next production, Sunday, won't be going ahead either.
All our shows this year have been affected by lockdowns. We've either been affected by reduced capacities, lockdowns themselves, or border closures. So the whole company this year has been affected by the lockdowns.
Virginia Lovett says the Melbourne Theatre Company has lost $19 million in ticket sales since the pandemic began. But today, the federal government has announced a $5 million grant to the company from the $50 million COVID-19 Arts Sustainability Fund. The Minister for the Arts, Paul Fletcher, says the company employs about 600 people and its sustainability was at risk. Ms Lovett says the funding boost is very welcome.
Oh, it's been extraordinary, and it's a much appreciated recognition of the role that MTC plays in the state. You know, we are the biggest makers of theatre and employer of theatre makers in the state. So this grant is going to obviously continue to create opportunities for our artistic community. So I'm very relieved. It's like we have been caught in a rip and this is a lifeline.
Michelle Ray from the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance is worried about the viability of theatre companies nationwide as the pandemic and its lockdowns continue.
Words can't begin to describe what it's like when work that you've programmed, perhaps even started to commence doing the development on, then just can't happen. Even when the lockdowns lift, it's often a longer period before our theatres become alive again. And so that means that there are performers, crew, front of house, venue people, all who are at home not knowing when they will be able to return to the work they love.
Are you confident that even when the vaccination rates do get to 70 or 80%, say in Sydney or Melbourne, that is going to guarantee that theatres will be able to stay open? Because it looks like once we open up, we're going to have very high case numbers.
I think it's all one of those where we have to see what that pathway post the vaccination rates looks like and how that'll impact. But in these industries, we've always worked with COVID safety plans, and those COVID safety plans were developed at the industry level in June of last year. And so when you look at the outbreaks, often the theatre workers and the live aren't part of the COVID kind of clusters, and that's because every day, front of house workers, crew members, performers work very hard at ensuring the COVID safety of the people who are watching and the workers who are working.
That's Michelle Ray from the Media, Entertainments and Arts Alliance, editing that report from Samantha Donovan. On ABC Radio across Australia, this is The World Today. Labor MP Joel Fitzgibbon has been a thorn in the side of party leader Anthony Albanese since the 2019 election, urging him not to abandon coal workers in the push for lower emissions. But today, the member for Hunter has announced he will not be contesting the next election. And Labor's opponents are already relishing the prospect of an upset victory in his Hunter Valley electorate. Political reporter Henry Bello filed this report.
For almost 4 decades, the federal seat of Hunter has been represented by a Fitzgibbon, from father Eric to son Joel. But now the family dynasty is coming to an end.
I feel it's time for me to explore new opportunities and to give someone fresh and new and probably younger the opportunities to serve this local community.
Mr Fitzgibbon believes his work is done. After suffering a huge swing against him at the last election, he's now claiming credit for softening Labor's position on climate change, noting a recent change in tact from the leader Anthony Albanese.
I've urged him back to the centre ground. He's been to a coal mine. He's expressed support for the coal mining industry and the gas sector.
Mr Fitzgibbon's departure won't surprise many in Labor. He quit the front bench in November after repeatedly clashing with Mr Albanese, calling on him to temper what he described as the urgings of elitist, idealistic and excessive progressives.
I believe he has struck a very good balance, and I think as a result he's well placed to lead us to an election victory, which means I can now exit stage left confident that I'm not letting anyone down.
His resignation may make it easier for Anthony Albanese to pursue a more ambitious climate change agenda, but it also makes the task of holding a once safe seat more difficult, something the Nationals leader and Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce knows all too well.
If I go to Muswellbrook, where Joel Fitzgibbon is retired from, and we will stand in and say to the people there, this is what will happen to your job, and this is why we're going into bat to make sure you keep your job.
Mr Joyce is already pitching his jobs first message to Mr Fitzgibbon's electorate. He leads a party that sees the coal industry as a core constituent, and with a 40-year family dynasty coming to an end, he thinks a steal is possible.
Yes, nothing's a walk in the park, but yes.
The Nationals came close to an unlikely victory in 2019, but support for the junior coalition partner was bolstered by a huge swing towards another pro-mining party, One Nation, which almost matched its primary vote, with its preferences flowing to the Nationals. Mr Fitzgibbon says he's confident Labor can reverse the electoral trend in Hunter, but admits it won't be easy.
When you lose people like our coal miners and those working in associated industries, you don't win them back easily.
His departure isn't the only personnel issue faced by the New South Wales Labor Party. The party's deputy leader in the Senate, Christina Keneally, will be parachuted into the lower house seat of Fowler in Sydney's western suburbs, pushing aside a Vietnamese-Australian lawyer who lives in the community. Some Labor MPs are uncomfortable about the message this sends to migrants, but Mr Fitzgibbon, who remains the leader of the party's right faction, has a different criticism.
I always prefer the selection of local community candidates, but you can understand why the party is seeking to retain someone like Christina Keneally. It is a shame that she couldn't be deployed to a marginal government-held seat, which we need to win to form government.
That's Labor MP Joel Fitzgibbon ending that report from Henry Bello. The Taliban has moved to reduce fears that Afghan women will be denied access to higher education as the world looks for signs that women's rights will be protected in the new Afghanistan. It says women will be allowed to continue studying in universities, but classrooms will be gender segregated and women will be subjected to strict dress codes. The announcement has come several days after the country's new rulers formed an all-male government, as Barney Porter reports.
The new reality has been outlined by Afghanistan's latest higher education minister, Abdul Bahi Haqqani. The policy of the Islamic Emirate is that female students can continue their higher education, he says, but only if they wear a hijab and if nothing is in conflict with Islamic Sharia laws or national values. There are other conditions that come with the dress code. The universities must have separate buildings for boys and girls, he says. A second solution could be separated classes, specific times for boys and then girls. A third solution is that if there are fewer female students, the class must be partitioned. The world has been watching closely to see if the Taliban acts differently from their first time in power in the late 1990s, when they ruled with a heavy hand that included bans on television and music. During that era, girls and women were denied an education and excluded from public life. The Taliban say they've changed their attitude towards women, but recent images of violence against female protesters demanding equal rights made headlines around the world. The Interior Ministry has since banned public demonstrations without prior permission, including the approval of slogans and banners. Mazia Ahmadi is a Taekwondo athlete in Kabul. I'm sorry to say that most men in Afghanistan are happy with the Taliban's arrival, she says. Men who are against the freedom and success of women in our society. Men who now shout at us when we walk on the streets, saying we can't move freely. I must say that if these same restrictions were imposed on them, they'd also come out and protest, like women are doing now. The Taliban officially raised their flag over the presidential palace on the weekend, the same time as the US marked the 20th anniversary of the September 11 attacks, which preempted the invasion of Afghanistan. And perhaps in a portent of the future, Taliban fighters inspecting the now abandoned military prison at the former US base of Bagram have vowed revenge for the treatment of former inmates.
Bunny Porter. Well, New South Wales is forging ahead with plans to reopen, but modelling suggests there will be a steep rise in case numbers even after 70% of the population is vaccinated. The plan agreed to by National Cabinet is based on modelling by the Doherty Institute. Some restrictions will be lifted at 70% vaccination, with more to follow at 80%. But the models rely on a range of human behaviour factors which may vary. Rachel Mealy reports.
If there's one thing we've learned from this pandemic, it's that predicting what happens next is an imprecise science. Stephen Duckett is the Director of the Health and Aged Care Program at the Grattan Institute.
You have to make a number of assumptions, both about how the virus spreads and also about how people react to how the virus is spreading. So we're making estimates of how virulent and how transmissible the virus is, given certain public health restrictions. And this is sort of a observational exercise, and so the modelling can't take all of those things into account.
He's described the New South Wales roadmap for reopening at 70% double dose as a risky gamble.
It's ambitious, and the real worry is, will the health system cope? You know, the health system in New South Wales is under huge pressure at the moment. And this will only make it worse.
Dr Duckett says with daily case numbers still rising, the state would be well advised to delay some stages of the reopening plan.
I don't think there's anything wrong with actually allowing some relaxation of restrictions when we hit, say, 70, 75, 80% of people vaccinated. The problem is, do you do it when the numbers are going up, which is still the situation in New South Wales? Do you do it when the health system is not coping, which is the situation in New South Wales, or are you a bit more cautious for what you do and when you do it?
Professor Mikhail Prokopenko is the Director of the Centre for Complex Systems at the University of Sydney. He and his team are crunching the numbers and predict that the current outbreak will peak across New South Wales, Victoria and the ACT next month.
Basically, by early October, we're tracking a 7-day rolling average, which obviously averages the 7 days before. So when I say the peak will happen in early October, I really mean maybe first week of October, but obviously it could happen a few days earlier, a few days later.
But that modelling points to another spike in cases after reopening.
Mostly driven by these transmissions between unvaccinated people, but still catching some vaccinated people as well. And in that case, it could really reach much, much higher levels of daily cases.
Tony Blakely is a professor of epidemiology at the University of Melbourne. He says it'll all come down to enforcement of the remaining restrictions.
So if you can enforce or encourage or make sure that when you open up in New South Wales, it really is just the double vaccinated who are going out to the cafes, who are spending more time together, it will be less problematic than if everybody does it by a long shot. The trick is going to be enforcement and doing it in a way that doesn't disrupt society too much.
That's Professor Tony Blakely from Melbourne University. Our reporter there, Rachel Mealy. That's all from The World Today team for this Monday. Thank you for listening in. Join us again at the same time tomorrow. I'm Sally Sarah. Take care.
Hi, I'm Angela Lapierre.
And I'm Stephen Smiley, and we're from the ABC's daily news podcast, The Signal.
New South Wales is now counting down to reopening in late October. It's more or less in line with the national plan announced by the federal government last month. But with every state and territory in a totally different situation, will everyone still want to stick with it?
Today on The Signal, Australia's extremely patchy and halting return to normal. Do the states and territories have to stick to the national plan? And if not, what do the next few months look like? Look for The Signal on the ABC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.